Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining today webinar. Also, I want to thank all the audience. I know it's the last day of Ramadan and most of you are fasting, so I really want to thank all of you. Also, I want to thank our keynote speaker and who is joining with us today in different university, different nationality, different countries around the world. Today we have a different as well keynote speaker. We'll talk about an interesting topic. Our keynote speaker is Dr. Wael Sharif Al-Din, is a lecturer of accounting, economic and management, and the chairperson of research and professional development committee, and the head of finance department at Kuwait College of Science and Technology, KCST. He holds a PhD in business administration from Grenoble École Management in France. Also, he holds an MBA and a Bachelor in Accounting and Finance from the Lebanese American University in Lebanon. His research interest is in risk management and corporate finance, especially information asymmetry and financial decision making. As well as he is a certified evaluation specialist, ICVS, and has more than 20 years of experience in finance advisory and financial management, covering fair valuation, corporate finance, transaction, and financial risk management. Thank you so much, Dr. Wael, for accepting our invitation. Before you start, allow me to ask all the audience, if you want to ask our keynote speaker, please ask him after the presentation. Dr. Wael have 45 minutes for his presentation, and then we'll open the floor for any question. You have two types to ask our keynote speaker your question. You can type your question in the Q&A below the screen, or you can raise your hand and we'll go one by one ask Dr. Wael your question. Please, don't type your question in the chat because the chat is keep rolling and we can't catch your question. Thank you so much, Dr. Wael. Thank you again for accepting my invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed, for inviting me for this interesting session. My topic today is mostly dedicated for people who want to know more about Kuwait, what happened during the financial crisis of 2008, and how the problem was dealt between investment companies who were distressed and banks. So let me share my screen. Okay, so hello everyone. Today's our webinar covers a topic that deals with information asymmetry in a context of debt rescheduling and financial restructuring during negotiation between debtors and creditors in Kuwait, subject to the financial crisis that took place in 2008. The reducing of information asymmetry tends to improve creditors' review and decision-making when approving any restructuring plan raised by distressed investment company. So the agenda for this presentation, first I will define for you what's information asymmetry, especially for the audience who are not familiar with this terminology. I'll give you an overview about the financial crisis in Kuwait and the problem statement. The research question subject to which I conducted my research and the available literature review, the research methodology followed, and the conceptual model that I developed. There will be a quick case study for two companies where I did in-depth analysis to do my research. Company A, I called company A, company B. The two companies are very well known in Kuwait, but and the information utilized were available to public, but just I prefer to keep using the presentation anonymous basis to call it company A, company B. Then I'll share with you the key findings, theoretical contribution and machine application, and we'll end with limitation and future research. So starting with defining what's information asymmetry. Information asymmetry, it's a condition where the information, where one party has more information than another party during dealing in, or what they want to, if they want to close a transaction. This creates a problem. If one party has more information than another party, they can take advantage to make the transaction fall in their favor. So this creates an imbalance in transaction. There are two types of information asymmetry. One type is called adverse selection. This occurs when there is unequal information between buyers and sellers. One party in a potential transaction has information that the other party lacks, so that transaction is more likely to be favorable to the party having the information. I can give an example. For any normal person who wants to go and buy a car from a used car from a seller, as a buyer, you try to negotiate the price. The seller knows more about the car in his hold. So if the buyer asking for a price, you try to negotiate, but you don't know about the car. Even if you take it for, let's say, quick check, you might end up buying more than what car value. This is an example of adverse selection because there's lack of information. The sellers know more about the car, about the prices. You don't know. You try maybe to do some search in order to minimize your information asymmetry with the seller, and so so that you can negotiate better the price. But in the case if you lack this information and you go and buy the car, this can be considered as adverse selection. Another one is moral hazard. And under this concept happens when one party has not entered into agreement in a good faith. And one party wants to take advantage, and they want to hide information or provide false information just to turn the transaction to be in their favor. So these are the two major types that goes under the information asymmetry. So after defining information asymmetry, I'll move to give an overview about the financial crisis that took place in Kuwait in the year 2008, the famous crisis. Before pre-financial crisis, the market in Kuwait was subject to growth majorly in two sectors, the real estate and investment sector, where we witnessed the establishment and listing of many companies belonging to these two tax sectors, which are the real estate and investment. During the crisis, the banks demanded the companies to pay their debts. So the companies having issues in liquidity, there was default on that, especially by large firms. This default and the market news had an impact where there was a crash in the stock exchange market, since a lot of these companies were listed and in the Kuwait stock exchange market. And banks or creditors, when they tried to deal with it, they face outdated insolvency laws, where the laws were not clear on how to deal with such big matters in Kuwait. Post-financial crisis, companies, especially the large ones, had to do financial restructuring. These financial restructuring plans to be shared with banks in order to negotiate debt rescheduling. Also, Central Bank of Kuwait at that time introduced a new law called financial stability laws. Companies approved with financial restructuring plans approved by CBK can go under financial stability law, where no one can raise any case in the court against these firms. Also, after financial crisis, there was the listing and suspending of many companies from trading. Many of these companies, especially the one not capable of doing their statutory financial reporting or submitting their financials, audited financials, due to high uncertainty or the issues in their companies, by this, they will not be abiding or complying with the Kuwait Stock Exchange market, and the Kuwait Exchange market in return will be suspending these companies from trading, especially there will be risk on investors having shares in the market. So this is, let's say, the a small overview on in general about financial crisis impact on Kuwait. Now, if you go to typical Kuwaiti investment firm, first I will introduce the sector. The investment sector in Kuwait, we had at that time around 100 companies. Out of the 100 investment companies, there were 55 listed. These companies went to the bank to raise capital or issued IPOs for public. This raising of capital, where they issued debt or equity, were utilized either to pay dividends. These dividends were based on accounting profit gain from revaluation in the income statement, which was not real. And also this debt or capital raised from IPOs also were utilized to pay interest charges to the banks for which where the companies had loans. During the crisis or after the crisis, 50% of these companies proved to be a solvent company. They hadn't just, they needed some time just for market to be adjusted, and they were capable of rescheduling their loans and pay back. The other 50% had liquidity issues. This liquidity issues came from asset liability mismatch. To explain this asset liability mismatch, companies were over leveraged. They were financing high risky assets, especially let's say when it comes to real estate projects under development, and they were financing this project by short-term loans. So the expectation for the projects to be developed and to be operating, let's say in a range of 4 years or more, where the financing terms were short, the companies had to settle to the bank within a period of 1 year or a year that falls before completing the project development and operating such project. This created asset liability mismatch. In terms of the banking sector in Kuwait, the banking sector has 10 local banks. 50% follows the conventional banking and 50% follows the Islamic banking. Also, in addition to the 10 local banks, you had 12 foreign banks. Yet these 12 foreign banks, as per CBK, which is Central Bank of Kuwait laws, they cannot operate in the retail banking. Out of the 10% out of the 10 local banks, the two major top creditors were NBK and Kuwait Finance House, KFH. 16% of corporate loans were granted to investment companies. And banks after the crisis had to deal with the booking provisions for non-performing loans, which created more losses on the bank financials. So this is in terms of sectors. In terms of a typical Kuwaiti investment firm at that time, the financing was done more by debt more than equity. The asset structure was more into having real estate, non-strategic marketable securities, unquoted investment with no consistent income, and a minority investment in strategic marketable securities, unquoted investment in income generating. The marketable securities, for people also not familiar with these terms, are the listed securities in the stock exchange. A non-strategic marketable security means they don't have big stake. It will be like a minority investment in liquid shares listed in stock market. And real estate, as defined or as known, is like lands or projects under development. The unquoted investment with no consistent income are investment in private firms with private shares not listed. No consistent income means they have very weak operations, not able to raise a consistent proper cash flows. Whereas the minority investment in strategic marketable securities, these are big stake in a listed company, where the unquoted investment also income generating if you also had investment in companies non-listed but having stable business and can generate cash flow. So there you can see there's imbalance in the assets or in their investment, which is more toward a non-strategic investment or investment in companies non-listed with no consistent income or real estate. So which was financed majorly by debt, not equity. So that was a typical Kuwaiti investment firm. Now about the problem statement, when the crisis happened and banks demanded companies to pay back their loans, they start negotiating several options. The major options which were subject to financial restructuring options for debt settlement are debt equity swap, capital raising, and divestitures. Debt equity swap is exchanging the debt issued by the bank to the companies by owning shares in these companies with the same value of the debt. Capital raising is granting time to the investment companies to seek the market to see if they can raise capital, and after raising capital, they can support whatever outstanding project which are viable projects, less like assets under development or real estate project under development, to complete this project, operate it, and after operating to start paying back to the banks. Or divestitures. Divestitures is start selling whatever assets they have as companies, and whatever they were able to raise as companies, distressed investment companies, fund raised to pay back the banks from these divestitures, which are exit of their current investment. So these were the major options available in terms of financial restructuring options in a financial restructuring plan in Kuwait. Now the problem, there were delays and uncertainties in raising funds to settle these debts. Banks were waiting after approving the financial restructuring plan issued by the investment company. These delays made the bank worries and raised uncertainty in terms, are these companies capable of committing to the plan and do the exit and sell their assets and pay back their loans? So that was the problem that took place in Kuwait at that time, which gave me the idea about going and research about this subject. Especially, I was involved. I worked for a distressed investment company. I had the practical experience. Also, I worked for an advisory company that worked on a restructuring plan to distressed companies. Also, I had an employment with one of the banks in Kuwait. This employment also, I was dealing with reviewing restructuring plans raised by debtors. So I had like the 360-degree view on this topic. For me, that's why I targeted doing this research, because I can have better interpretation about what was happening, having the several roles throughout a financial restructuring plan transaction. So the question is, first, to identify what were the gaps to be identified inside the financial restructuring plans when it comes to dealing with divestiture option in Kuwait, and to look how to reduce information asymmetry impact on creditors' decision-making. So the research was more in favor of creditors and banks. Banks were the weak points and when it comes to this kind of transaction. Bank wants their money back. The company has to prepare, or the distressed investment company has to prepare the restructuring plan along with advisors, present to the bank. Bank has to approve in order to reschedule the loans granted to these companies. So the bank was, or creditor was the weak point, doesn't know what's happening inside these companies, and they have to accept whatever was presented by them. They can do some due diligence, but it will be very limited. Accordingly, I took this research to see how to reduce the advantage of information in the hand of debtors in order for the sake of the banks to do a better decision making on when they are reviewing the restructuring plan. So this research tends, as I said, to improve creditors' review of the divestiture option and restructuring plan to make appropriate decision for debt rescheduling and settlement in Kuwait. Now, going through the literature review that can contribute answering the research question, this is a summary of after I went through more than 70 articles, and this was the summary out of these articles that I went through. The main authors contributing to answer this question are Kosnik, Shapiro, Gilson, Brown, Ashtab, Bow, Relly, Schleifer, Subramaniam, and Wild. In terms of gaps to be identified, the gaps could be listed under the identified major issues. Some of the research, academic research available in the literature talked about agency conflict, where the advisors are biased with their financial gains. So they are not dealing with professionalism in terms of their client interest or third-party interest with transparency. They were looking more how to raise their fees, looking more for the financial gains. This is one of, in terms of part of agency conflict. Another gap about stockholders misstating value of firm. So stockholders, when dealing with the banks, they tend to overstate the value of their companies. Also, the management managing the process inside the distressed companies, acting for their own interest in setting and selecting assumptions, since management has interest to keep their jobs, and if they have any other benefit throughout these transactions, they will not act at arm's length. So these were the major gaps identified. When it comes to solution to be recommended, corporate clients can separate advisors' fee from transaction value in order to limit the bias of the advisors. Governance restructuring to replace top management, hiring advisors to do due diligence on sellers' assets, buyers to discount value of firms in uncertain markets, selecting buyers from same industry, using book value as basis for distressed firm valuation. So these were, let's say, whatever in the existing literature, available literature, were the major solutions or recommendations to minimize information asymmetry. But there were gaps, the gaps in the literature. This literature didn't go in-depth analysis to know through case studies to understand what's going, or to open the black box of a distressed company and to know more about the restructuring, how it was cooked. And that was recommended by one of the researchers, Ashta et al. In their article. Also, there was limited literature on how to reduce information asymmetry when it comes from creditors' perspective, from banks' perspective. It more talks about stockholders, between stockholders and management, between management and let's say in the stock market and investors, but not from creditors' perspective, especially in the level of these 4 steps, about what were the criteria of assets selected for the divestitures, what was the basis in selecting these assets to sell by the companies, about how valid and reliable are the assumptions applied during the valuation of these selected assets, about if there are really buyers interested, and these buyers, if they exist or no in the market to buy these assets subject for sales, about achievability of divestiture within the timeline set by the company for that settlement. So these were the 4 main points to reduce information asymmetry regarding. The research methodology that I decided to follow was more the qualitative approach. I didn't want to go into quantitative because I want to have to explore what were the available solutions in the market. I didn't know to go and do testing. So this approach followed a bottom-up model where I started with literature and then do exploratory field study, which will end with the specific or suggested solution or theory. The methodology that I followed was case study, in-depth case study, on 2 big companies in Kuwait. And the data analysis were derived from firm-specific and external factors during selection valuation of assets to be divested, as I mentioned earlier, existing of potential buyers and divestiture plan timeline. Now, I'll list for you, let's say, the problem issue. So in any transaction, especially in the financial restructuring transaction, you have 2 sides, the debtor side stakeholders and the creditor side stakeholders. The debtor side stakeholders involve the shareholders, the owners of the distressed companies, the management who are managing the process and dealing with the advisors and and shareholders, and the advisors appointed by debtors to support them with the financial restructuring plan to be negotiated with the creditors. On the creditor side, you have the creditors themselves, which are the banks or lending institutions, and their advisors also. Every one of these stakeholders has its own interest. The shareholders, their interest is to keep the company assets, whereas the management to keep their job, to retain their job along with their other benefits. Advisors from both sides, from creditors and debtors side, they want to generate the maximum fee they can generate from these transactions. So these are the interests in terms of debtors. Whereas creditors, their main interest, specifically as a bank, is loan settlement for companies to pay back their loans. This is the direct interest. The indirect, in case company cannot pay loans, they have interest in acquiring or taking over the assets owned by these companies. So this is in general what are the interests of these stakeholders. Now going through firm-specific factors and external factors. The firm-specific factors are the internal factors inside the firm. The management of the company, after aligning with shareholders, are the one selecting the criteria of assets selected for divestitures, are the one putting the management, putting the assumptions and the forecast and guiding the valuation, and classifying the assets divestiture on a timeline plan. They say they list the assets subject to sale. They say this asset will be sold within 1 year. This second asset will be sold in the coming 2 years. So they are the one putting the timeline to be discussed with the banks. Whereas the external factors are more related to market. These external factors are uncertain economic markets and uncertain market data. Usually during crisis, all the available market data won't be reliable because sectors are not performing like normal. So whatever you're taking from the market as KPIs could not be relevant during a crisis time. Also, as the external factor, we have advisors' integrity. You don't know these advisors appointed, although they have big names, how much you will be doing in due care dealing with clients. The existence of potential buyers, no one knows what, if you have a potential buyer in the market, what are the interests of these potential buyers? And time to close transaction. There are factors that will impact time to close transaction. So going one by one, the criteria of assets selected for divestitures, and most of the plans of the financial restructuring plans prepared in Kuwait, they contained non-core assets and part of core assets when need to generate quick cash. The non-core assets could be majorly, as I said, from a typical investment company, could be real estate, could be non-strategic investment in non-income generating companies. Whereas a part, what could be considered as part of core assets, these kind of liquid assets like listed shares in the Kuwait stock exchange, these assets can be sold easier to make quick payments and generate quick cash for these companies. The financial forecast and asset classification and a timeline, these were driven by a management assumption. When it comes now to external factors, the uncertain economic market and uncertain market data available at that time were used by management in benchmarking and in building their forecast. Advisor integrity, the advisors has influence over the outcome of financial restructuring plan because they can guide and they are putting their names in the documents prepared. Potential buyers, mostly of the potential buyers during a crisis, they are looking for fire sales and highly discounted opportunities. Time to close the transaction during a crisis time, it could be more time consuming during such times. That was the conceptual model that I developed in order to minimize information asymmetry. So the shareholders, management and advisors, they will be putting the financial restructuring plan and they will developing based on firm-specific factor and some with the impact of external factors. Bank, before taking decision, has to minimize or reduce information asymmetry at the level of each level of the firm-specific factor and external factor before taking their decision, so they can take a better decision regarding specifically the divestiture option in such a restructuring plan. So that was the model I developed, and the research was done following this model. I followed the cognitive mapping, the sequential base, because always when doing a divestiture option inside a financial restructuring plan, always start with selecting what are the assets to be sold or to be divested. That was sequential. This is followed by evaluation of the selected assets, then assuming or looking at building data of what could be a potential buyer for these assets available for sale. And the last one, the achievability of such sale of assets during a certain timeline. So the creditors making decision on this option and the restructuring plan has to build rationale and by reducing information asymmetry at the level of each point, which I named X1, X2, X3, and X4 before taking any decision. The sampling that I did, as I said, I did the case study on 2 companies which are considered the largest investment companies in Kuwait. These are the criteria of the company selected. One was followed Islamic model, the other one conventional model. Both had a debt level of more than $1 billion. Both were listed in the Kuwait stock exchange market. Both had conglomerate business model with multinational exposure, and both had restructuring plans that were negotiated with the bank. These 2 largest were considered as the two typical investment companies in Kuwait. In terms of the following Islamic or convention, there was no really a big difference between these 2 companies. This difference was insignificant. Especially, the difference was only when selecting investment opportunity, whether it follows Sharia or no. But in terms of operations, almost both had the same way of operations. But why selecting 2 companies? Because the 2 companies has different approach in negotiating their plans with the creditors. In terms of data selected, the data combined both secondary data and primary data. When I did the case study at the level of each company, the secondary data restructuring plans that were presented in the analyst public reports, the industry analysis report, published financial statements for these companies, company press releases, and the newspapers. Whereas the primary data, I conducted semi-structured interviews with distressed company management, creditors, granting loans to these companies, potential buyers, and external independent corporate finance advisors. The interviews covered 21 selected participants across, as I said, the distressed company management, creditors, advisors, and potential buyers. The questions were, the category of questions supported answering about topics about financial advisors' integrity, criteria of assets selected for sale and valuation methods applied, source of reliable information to validate management assumptions, identifying potential buyers for assets subject to sale, reasons behind delay in completing divestiture transaction, recommendation to mitigate information asymmetry between debtors and the creditors. The first case study related to Company A. First, I analyzed the classification of company key assets. Most of the assets, 57% of the assets were real estate, belong to real estate sector, 18% to financial service sector, 16% to fee-based service sectors, and 9% luxury automotive. Valuation of these key assets were estimated to be in 1.7 billion KD versus 1 billion in the book value. The valuation methods adopted were DCF method, book value basis for valuation, mark to market to listed company, independent appraiser for real estate assets. DCF is for people who are not familiar with valuation methods, the DCF method is more about building a forecast for the future to understand more about company operations, how much this company can make cash flow in the future, and then discounted this cash flow to see how much they are the value today as a present value. So this is the DCF method. Book value basis for valuation, this mostly could be considered as the accounting value, whatever represented in the audited financial statements. Mark to market for listed company, this is how much the company are worth in as per the Kuwait Stock Exchange price. A dependent appraiser for real estate assets like lands, when you're assigning someone expert in lands who know how to value lands, this would be considered as independent appraiser. The total debts of the company, as you can see, is 1.2 billion. So also here you can see there is a mismatch between the book value and the total debt, whereas the expected future valuation to reach 1.7. So the management and owners are considering that the future value of 1.7 can settle the full debts, and they can keep more in assets and in the company. Whereas the book value is lower than, which is the accounting value is lower than the actual debts owed to the bank. The debts were owed to 50% of the debts owed to Kuwaiti banks, 50%, and 32% to other GCC banks, 15% to European banks, and 3% to other banks. In terms of the debt settlement plan, in year one, the expectation was to pay individual creditors 16 million KD, whereas in year two, to pay to small non-financial institution with a value of 66 million of the total debt, and the rest remaining, the biggest portion of the debt, 1.1 billion, which is owed to big financial institutions and banks, were estimated to be paid within the year 3 to year 7. That was a debt settlement plan that was listed in the restructuring plans that was negotiated with the banks. The assets selected for sale for company A are the non-core assets. In year one, they were looking to divest around 0.3 billion KD, belonging to 45% of which are belonging to real estate sector, 25% to financial services, 30% to fees-based services. Whereas in year 3 to year 5, the estimation is to liquidate 0.5 billion, 55% out of which was also related to real estate sector, 5% to financial services, 40% to fees-based services. The problem was the financial or the valuation or assumptions that were considered by management of the distressed investment companies. They considered a fair value of assets and base case scenario where companies were looking to maximize value. They didn't consider a conservative scenario. If the market, this downturn in the market remained for a longer period, they didn't consider this scenario. They just went on a base case with optimistic view toward the future. The case study covered for the second company also showed the classification of assets. 46% to real estate, also biggest stake is more toward real estate, 39% financial services, and 15% fees-based service. The debt, the value of key assets were considered to be 0.6 versus 0.5 billion in book value. So if you can compare between company A and company B considered really a big difference in terms of value versus book value, whereas company B, their valuation was more close to their book value. Also, they followed, in terms of valuation, DCF, NAV, mark-to-market, independent appraiser. The difference between NAV, net asset value, and the book value is more like replacement cost. The values are close to book value, but more adjustment of the replacement, how much will be compared, for example, assets, if they have assets like, let's make simple example, cars. If the car's value in the books of the company is, and it's lease, for example, they do car leasing business, let's say 5,000 KD, where the market value for the same car is 6,000, they replace the 5,000 by 6,000. This would be considered like net asset value. If they have equipment, also how much will be the replacement cost of the book value of their equipment, how much the value of in the market. This is a NAV valuation. Where their loans were 0.9, you can see their assumptions that they will never be able to pay fully their loans. That's why this company went into two models. Partially is divestiture, and the rest is debt to equity swap. Their loans were mainly allocated 44% in KD, 13% in UAE dirhams, 1% in euro, and 42% in USD. 81% of the 0.9 billion were in short-term financing commitments. Their debt settlement plan, they didn't go into in terms of like previous company. They were paying based on the categories of creditors that they have. In the first year, are paying the small creditors. In the second year, small companies creditors, and in the third year, big banks and big financial institutions. Whereas this one, they were looking how to pay percentage of that: 10% in year one, 20% in year two, and 70% in year three. If we ignore the debt to equity swap, just focusing on their divestiture option and their restructuring plan, they were looking in year one to sell their quoted assets, which is liquid, to raise some of the required funds. So if you compare both company A and company B, company A are looking to sell real estate, 45% in real estate in year one, whereas company B in year one looking to sell liquid assets. So their restructuring plan was more, there was more rationale in building the restructuring plan, because always liquid assets have more tendency to be sold during financial crisis times in the first years, not like selling real estate. In the year two, selling unquoted assets belonging to sectors such as healthcare, telecommunication, education. Also, these sectors there was demand onto acquiring or buying assets belonging to these sectors, which is like hospitals, medical clinics, telecom, schools, because these sectors are always operating. Even during financial crisis, there is demand for the service provided by these sectors. So there is also high potential to be able to sell assets belonging to these sectors. Where in year three, selling illiquid assets such as real estate forecasted to achieve high value to cover the biggest portion of the original amount of the rescheduled bank debt. Lands and projects under development. This company B, when they were developing their plans, they were gambling or putting hopes on time. After 2 years, they were thinking in year three, market will go back to normal. So there will be more demand on real estate. People will have more cash to go and do the acquisition of such assets. Even let's say if they were able to complete some development or project with 90% completion under development in real estate sector, they were able to complete it and to be able to sell it at higher value. So that was the comparison between the two companies in terms of the restructuring plan develops, in terms of their assets classification and that settlement plan. In terms of findings, the findings in terms of selection of assets to be divested, criteria of assets selected to be sold, mostly non-core, non-performing and liquid assets, which contained vacant land, real estate under development, equity holding of weak non-recurring revenue, weak cash flows. This kind of equity holding, if you have ownership in a company with no stable business, today you are making, or this month you are making a profit on 1,000 and you're getting this cash, maybe next month you're not making any sales. So they have up and down in their operations, which is creating a weak cash flows. Also, one of the problems, the management were not obliged in sharing with the creditors what was the criteria of the assets selected for divestitures, and to give full disclosure about quality of these assets subject to sales. They just have names of the companies to be sold, but banks were not allowed to go and check the quality of these companies, how much there is high potential for them to be sold and at this desired value. Also, one of the problems in the selection of assets is the role of advisors in terms of their integrity, influence at that time. So advisors didn't have influence over management. They were more coming from international markets and they lack expertise in the local market of Kuwait. Advisors' role was more into the fine-tuning the presentations, polishing the management reports to creditors with their name and the fancy graphs and visuals to be able to put influence on the bank and good impression. They were using their name with the good presentations to be presented to them, whereas the content is more driven by management. Creditors relied on the integrity of information provided by management and advisors in doing or taking their decision toward these plans. Also, at that times, in terms of uncertain economic markets, it was poor economic condition, decline in investor liquidity. Also, credit markets were closed. No banks were giving any additional credit to new credit to anyone who's seeking credit at that time, which has affected negatively on the saleability of the selected liquid non-core assets within the timeline set by the companies. In terms of valuation, there was one independent valuation firm hired by the distressed company to do the valuation exercise. They did the valuation based on management assumptions, which has affected the reliability of the financial forecast. The data was outdated in the valuation reports utilized, with misstated book value. Book values were based on very old audited financials, not recent one. So the discussions with the creditors was based on outdated data. advisors' integrity. Sometimes the advisors doing valuation for assets under development or like real estate under development, they applied even during crisis the DCF, which is discounted cash flow, which is not a right method to be applied during crisis time and during discussion and negotiation of that settlement with banks. So that was wrong approach selected for valuation. The quality of audit reports by auditing firm doing advisory to the same client was questionable. Advisors were not liable in case of omission of in the representation letter that make management sign, and in the disclosure and the reports always they don't claim any liability toward any omission of information. This will weaken the opinion of advisors. In terms of uncertain market data, historical data to validate and challenge management assumptions were inflated, and getting future data was not reliable from available sources during crisis time, as I mentioned earlier. Uncertainty in the market data, such as market multiples used in benchmarking companies, also we have doubt about it. So this is in terms of valuation of assets. In terms of existence of potential buyers, divestitures were planned from the perspective of buyers and not from perspective of sellers and not buyers. So negotiation power was in the hand of buyers, affecting lower valuation for assets selected for sale. The existence of few potential buyers interested to acquire at discounted prices the trophy assets of companies. So when I did this interviews and with buyers and with participants of about who could be the potential part of the assets and what are your interests in terms of acquisitions from these companies, everybody was more toward the trophy assets, not the assets which were part of the divestiture option plan, the non-core assets. So everybody wants the trophy assets and they wanted to acquire them at discounted price, where the companies, investment companies are offering the non-core assets, not the trophy assets. Distressed firms search for potential buyers didn't consider also potential synergy in the market, where some of their non-core assets could be core business for other affected negatively the base of available buyers. So when the company, distressed company, were looking for buyers, they didn't look also for buyers where the assets of the distressed company could present for them a good opportunity to build synergy. So they have a very weak list of available buyers. Also, there was difficulties to find buyers with adequate liquidity during financial crisis. Everybody looking to keep cash or how to raise cash. So liquidity was a problem in the market. Real existence of potential buyers, as per debtors' claims, was not verified by creditors. So when creditors are approving the financial restructuring plan, they were counting on the integrity of advisors and management presenting these financials. They didn't ask to these sides of debtor stakeholders to present any proof that you have a buyer, any MOU, any letter of intent for the asset subject to sales. In terms of achievability of the divestiture timeline, there was higher chances to complete the divestiture on time for liquid assets rather than illiquid assets. So you can sell a listed company easier than selling a real estate or vacant land. A distressed company not showing discipline in executing the divestiture plan with creditors and not able to show control over timeline set for the divestitures. So based on the timeline year 1, year 2, year 3, there was no discipline to commit to this plan, where the companies, distressed companies, lost control over the plan they set and they agreed with the banks. Creditors not showing concern on mismatch between value of debt and amounts to be raised from divestitures, not in favor of debt settlement according to agreed timeline. For example, in the case of Company B, the debts were more than the assets subject to sales, so the banks didn't show concern over such a matter. Time to close transaction. The sales process during financial crisis is time consuming, when market is for buyer and not seller. If buyer doesn't want to buy, seller cannot do anything. They will keep hold of these assets and they cannot settle back their loans to the bank. Availability of too many alternative of similar assets, this created the problems. Most of the companies who were doing restructuring and want to pay their loans were offering the real estate properties for sale. So these similarities created a high supply of assets subject to sale with same nature. So this created difficulties in selling these assets for these companies. Illiquidity in market, where potential buyers had scarcity in cash resources, delayed also the timeline to close divestiture deals. In terms of theoretical contribution, the main contribution to literature was providing an in-depth focused restructuring case studies with a new proposed conceptual model for creditors. The idea that we discovered about many alternatives of similar assets available for sale in the market, delaying the timeline to complete the divestitures. One of the literature suggested following the book value and valuing the distressed companies, where the market showed, the real case showed that need to adjust these book values for impairment of assets before using them in valuing distressed firms during financial crisis. That was the theoretical contribution. In terms of managerial implication, how to reduce information asymmetry from creditor's side, to enhance governance restructuring by appointing creditors representative on the board of directors for distressed companies to know more about what's going inside these companies. Creditors to set up their own due diligence team from the local market professionals with business know-how, so they can build their team having the know-how in the market in certain sectors, they can give better advice than international advisors. Creditors to review industry reports to understand industries where assets selected for the divestiture are functioning. So any asset available for sale, they can go as creditors, look into available market reports to see what's going on for this, for the sector to which these assets belong, to be able to understand and to minimize the uncertainty about assumptions behind selling these assets. Creditors and not debtors to be the client hiring the advisors. So in order not to have control by debtors over the advisors, the creditors should be the client hiring these advisors and paying their fees. Creditors to require at least 2 independent valuators, not like the case that I showed you for both company A and company B, where there was only one valuator for each company. We need to have at least 2 independent valuators with the scope to validate management assumptions, not only taking management assumption and give value. They have to validate management assumptions and to be updated on a periodic basis. And the last one, creditors to ask management for a proof about commitment of potential buyers interested to acquire assets selected for sale. So saying we have buyers, not enough for creditors. The debtors has to show proof that they are negotiating potential exits with potential buyers, not just talks that there are buyers. Banks has to see proof and evidence. In terms of limitation and the future research, the limitation of this research was the finding cannot be generalized due to the nature of the study aiming to solve this problem in Kuwait. Selection of suitable participants to attend the semi-structured interviews was based on my assessment. Respondents' biases when answering interviews questions. The future research could be a case study on financial restructuring plan to explore whether debt to equity swap or divestiture would be the recommended restructuring option to creditors. To test if creditors are approving financial restructuring plans while being aware of the gaps surrounding such plans in order to avoid booking provisions for non-performing loans. To test if reviewing industry reports by creditors will reduce information asymmetry with debtors regarding quality and sellability of assets selected for divestitures. At the end, reaching the end of this presentation, I would like to thank you for your attendance. So now the floor is yours to start raising your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wael, for the informative and very useful presentation on the topic as well. Before I start, I have some questions, but let's ask the audience if you have any question, please raise your hand to ask Dr. Wael, or you can write your question in Q&A. If you have a question, please just raise your hand and we'll go one by one to ask Dr. Wael. Dr. Wael, let me start. I think the best thing in the research and for this webinars and also in conferences to improve the paper. I think this is the main purpose of this. So yes. Let me ask you some questions and some rooms for improvement. You start your presentation with information asymmetry and you talk about it and the problems. That's good. But why you didn't support your paper with the theory? for example. So I think the best theory it's that you can use it, which is the agency theory.
Yes.
It will support your
in my original paper, I talked about the agency theory, but I didn't include for the presentation just to keep the topic limited to this size.
That's fine, but you should support. Now there's two things to support your research idea. One of them you use it in the presentation, which is the key authors in the literature review, which is you list some of them, which is the key author or the main author of the paper. The second thing, which is the theory, you need to use theory. So that's good. You use it in the main paper, but not in the presentation. That's fine. The second question, if you use agency theory, why you use it? There is many other theories. So what is the special thing? That's good, of course. If you didn't use agency theory, there is a question mark. Why you didn't use agency? But if there is another theory that you need to use it. So nowadays, before, let's say in US, for example, they didn't use theories at all. Most of papers that publish in US, their school, their research school, let's say, they didn't use any theories. But let's say in Middle East, in Europe, in UK, Australia as well, they use theory. But nowadays, if you see the publishing paper, they use multiple theories. So if you use more than one theories, that will support your idea. So that's good. Also use.
So for me, Sophia, going back to the point about agency theory, when applying this theory to my research, the principal would be the creditor, and the agent will be the debtor side stakeholders in terms of applicability between two sides, principal and agent, where everyone has his own interest. And so I covered the theory from this perspective.
That's good. Let me go back to, I have another question, and then we have another question from Dr. Omar. Now you choose Dr. Kuwait. So why you choose Kuwait, and what is the special thing in Kuwait, not in GCC, for example? This is one of big question they will ask you when you want to send it to an editor or for the journal.
Yes.
So many journals, they ask for cross countries, or if you choose a country, why you choose this country?
Hello, first, there was no similar study done for Kuwait. This is Kuwait as special market. The second one, I have as a researcher, I had the expertise working in Kuwait toward this problem itself. So I can have better interpretation of data in this market. Whereas if I talk about UAE, I might miss many things because I was not part of the and I was not dealing with this problem and that other market. I might miss something. That's why I selected Kuwait specifically, having the expertise in the market when it comes to such topic.
So is your answer mean that Qatar, Emirates, Saudi Arabia, that don't have the same issue?
In terms of same issue, Dubai has different because that was a bubble. Also, it has this problem in Dubai. But for me, my expertise was more dedicated to Kuwait because I worked in Kuwait with this company, the distress company.
I totally understand your experience, and as I in the beginning of the presentation, I talked about your biography and this stuff. But in the editor, they don't care about all of these personal information. What you need to do, Doctor, you need to dig down. What is the special thing in Kuwait? Talk about political. Talk about the Dastur. What is the Kuwait Code, for example, which is published in 2013. Talk about the regulation. Talk about the. You need to find there is something special in Kuwait, not in the other countries. So, for example, if you want to publish in US journals or in Europe, they have some papers in UK, they have some paper in Russia, in Asia. So why you choose Kuwait? This is there is question. So
one of the problem in Kuwait, before the crisis, the investment companies were under the governance of central bank, where in other markets under capital market authority.
It depends if it's financial or non-financial. So yes. This is one of the other questions. Are you talking about financial or non-financial?
Yeah, no, in general, I'm talking in general. Investment companies, there were no regulator in Kuwait other than a bank for investment companies. CMA was established as an answer or to address this problem later. So let's say the investment companies, banks ask the investment companies to provide with their plans to the central bank about their settlement, their situation, to provide some KPIs during the crisis time. And the bank, a central bank, not expert in terms of how to manage investment companies, it's more how to deal with banking. This created a problem in sending perplexed messages to the market and create more uncertainty about, create more problems in terms of settlement of loans. One time after the crisis, central bank issued the financial stability law, which is famous in Kuwait. If the there are certain companies, not all companies really adopted to this or be approved to be under this financial stability law, which will give them protection against courts. So that was like more experimenting the problem instead of having real solution for it. Later came the establishment of Capital Market Authority to govern this sector with proper expertise, proper laws, proper dealing with investors and market. So at that time, Kuwait was not ready like other markets to handle the situation. They didn't have proper rules or laws. That's what makes special also Kuwait with handling this case.
That's good. So you need to write this in the paper to support this question, because 100% they will ask you about this. 100%. We have a question from Dr. Umar. What creditor can do with distressed SME companies because of COVID novel, if debt to equity swap is not an option, especially for micro enterprises? You can read the question in Q&A if you want.
I'm reading it, but I still didn't get exactly what's the point.
Dr. Umar, may you raise your hand, please, Dr. Umar? Umar Isam.
Hi.
Hello, hello, Dr. Umar.
Hi, I am Amr Isam. I'm not a doctor. I'm a credit manager inside the Kuwait.
Okay.
Hello,
I
hello,
have hi. Just a simple questions. If a debt an option is, if the debt to equity swap is not an option, especially for micro enterprises, small medium enterprises here, which advantage with low qualified or low educated personnel or management, and they refuse something like that, and we need to solve this situation during this distress. They cannot pay the installments, blah blah blah, to not book a high provision inside our financials. What we can do if debt to equity swap is not an option? That's it.
You're saying it's not an option from the debtor side? They don't want that to equity swap?
Yeah, from the debtor side,
Yeah, after I went through, let's say, especially meeting with banks, risk management team, and what I saw even from the accountancy, what happened inside the bank, there was no way not to book provision. All the banks had to book provision to cover for this risk. Avoiding provision, some banks tried to delay booking provision in their financials, but at the end, they had to go into booking provision. If you want to be conservative, because if there's no option to take long, especially they cannot pay and they don't want to give you shares in their company so you can liquidate later on, there is no way you cannot book a provision in the future. The best way for the bank, after I saw cases in KFH and NBK and other banks, they start in first year to delay. At the end, they book full provision, all this bank and the Kuwait, and whatever they can recover, they will be recovering and add back to their incomes. That's what I observed when I did my research. And to answer back your question, there is no way not to book provision in these situations.
Thanks, doctor. I agree with you.
Thank you, Umar. Dr. Asia, also she has a question. Just a minute. Yeah, Dr. Asia, her question about what is the best solution to reschedule debt?
The best solution, let's say that there are layers when it comes to rescheduling that. Here in my presentation, I talk about only three. One of them is restructuring loan terms. That's usually the first step. You can negotiate with the bank. If you have short-term loans, you make it long-term loans with higher interest. This is the classic one, where more of the banks in the negotiation they follow. The second one, in case of really tough markets and there is limited cash, haircut has to be done on loans. Disposal of assets, I'm going by sequence. Restructuring loan terms, haircut on loans, then I go into divestitures or selling of assets, and the last one, debt to equity swap. Why I'm keeping debt to equity swap the last? Especially in Kuwait, there is article called Article 66, where banks, if they do any debt to equity swap, they cannot hold assets in the private sector company more than 2 years. This is a law in Kuwait by central bank for the banks. Any settlement, in-kind settlement, where the bank takes hold of assets, they cannot hold them more than 2 years. They have to sell it within 2 years. When it comes to land or real estate, it's the same law, but it's on longer period. Instead of 2 years, 3 years. So the bank will, the problem will move from company to the bank later on, when in the debt to equity swap option. So always the best one to keep servicing the loan. By keeping servicing the loan, coming back to Amr's question, bank can delay booking provision because they extend the loan period against higher interest. So and the client, but under the condition that the debtor will be paying interest or cost of loan financing monthly to keep servicing the loan. The problem will be only with the principal to delay it until they have cash. So this will be one of the easy solution to be adopted. Otherwise, haircut on loans to take whatever cash have with the company to pay the bank. Then divestitures. Divestiture will also have several layers. Start selling with trophy assets or liquid assets, not the non-core assets, because this will be generate cash easily and quicker. And the last one, that equity swap. This is answering your question.
Thank you. Back to me, Dr. Also, you choose 2 companies as a case study. So why did you choose these 2 companies, and what is those companies? Why didn't choose, for example, all the financial companies or all non-financial company listed or not listed in the Kuwait Borsa? I just ask you this question to avoid bias.
Yeah, for me, let's say in terms of secondary data available, I had insider information working for one of these companies, but I didn't. In terms of research, I have to refer to public available data. So these 2 companies, because they were popular in the media and the newspaper, a lot of analysis covering these companies. So the data available for these 2 companies were a lot. That's why I selected these 2 companies. Instead of going into a pool of, let's say, all the companies available in the market, where I'll be faced in the future with data limitation, access to data.
But is those
and these 2 companies really in the market, they had big stake in the stock exchange market because they have many subsidiaries also listed in the market, so they have big volume.
What is those?
Sorry.
What is the name of those companies?
Yeah, I didn't mention during the presentation, but one of them is the Investment DAR and the other one a Global Investment House.
So both of them financial companies.
Yes.
Both of them financial companies. So if you go to the Borsa website, you will find the information, or you can go back to annual report. Of course, there is I know it's hard.
Yeah, but information about restructuring, specific restructuring plans, this is mainly produced by analysts, let's say MBK analysts or other companies. There were no interest in small companies to analyze. So in order to access data related to restructuring plans, these 2 companies were showed as subject were interesting to other analysts to go and analyze.
Okay, it's your field, Doctor. But search or Google it in Google Scholar or any other engine. agent, check if there is any paper published in the same topic in GCC, and then compare it with your paper. If, for example, let's say as an example, there is a paper talk about similar or same topic, different angle, but in Saudi Arabia, if they are their sample all the financial companies, for example. So this is will open a question for you: why there is no, why you chose just 2 companies? So you have 2 things now. This is just an advice, okay? And it's up to the editor if they will ask you this question or no. If you choose 2, that's fine, but you need to say why you choose those 2. Maybe there is those the biggest 2. Is those are the smaller companies? What is the special? Think of those companies.
Yes.
Okay. Last question. What's your research contribution? What is the contribution of this paper?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, let me just go back to here. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, there was no in-depth restructuring case studies. Most of the restructuring case studies from the existing literature just touched the surface, didn't go deep inside, studying inside the company, the process of selecting assets, valuating, and this process, the whole process was not covered in depth. So this is one contribution when going in depth and analyzing each level from selecting of assets until putting a timeline for these assets to be sold. And specifically also giving the contribution regarding Kuwait market as a market by itself. Also, the literature focused more on focusing on a book value based to do the restructuring, to do the evaluation, where the observation that I had, this book value has to be adjusted before doing the valuation. I didn't see any research talk about adjusting book value before conducting evaluation for distressed firm. Always the one available talk about book value only. So this could be another contribution also to literature.
So your contribution just in the literature review, right? So you didn't have any contribution, for example, in the variable, let's say, or in the measurement, or in other term. No,
there is one. This is for theoretical. For managerial, more like giving a guideline for creditors to follow when they are reviewing a financial restructuring plan.
Okay. I think there is. This is for that's it for me. I think there is a question. I don't know if it's a question or no. And from Dr. Ali Semeni. Is it possible to host guests in the internal audit and separate knowledge about practical causes reality in the internal audit about process?
I didn't understand. Sorry, yeah. I didn't understand clear.
Ali, if you don't mind, raise your hand. If you don't mind, because me too, I didn't, I didn't understand well. If you don't mind, raise your hand so we can answer your question. Ali Semeni.
I think he's just talking in general about guests to talk about topics related to internal audit with practical cases.
Yeah, I think too. Anyone had any question? أي حد عنده أي سؤال? You can ask in Arabic or English. That's fine. In Q&A you can ask in Arabic or in English. Anyone had any question? أي سؤال؟ Dr. Wael, thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you for your time and your effort. I know it's Ramadan and it's hard, you know, to present in this time. But really, I want to thank you for your presentation, effort, and your time. Jazakallah khair. And I hope, inshallah, in the future, this paper it will be published in high-rank journal. You are always welcome to present here in ITAR. One of our, you are now one of our family in this group. Inshallah, it won't be the last time. It will be a beginning of series of other lecture by you, inshallah. If you have your any last word, Dr. Wael.
No, I would like first to thank you for the invitation and to open the ground for me to present this topic. It's interesting concept that you made for ITAR, especially with these situations, webinars. The access to webinars is easier than having real conferences. Also, this has advantage and benefit to the presenter, as you mentioned, to be exposed to questions in order to enhance the paper. So I would like to thank you for this. I would like to thank you also the audience for the interest to attend, to know more about these topics. I tried as much as I can to be concise because the paper I had was very big with a lot of details, and also to be more user-friendly for people who are not in this field to be able to understand the concept I'm presenting.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Thank you, appreciate it. Inshallah, next week, I will, let me, just a minute. So this webinar is recorded already and live in the YouTube. I put in the chat all the accounts that for next webinar, so you can register in the next webinar. Inshallah, will be in next Wednesday with a new topic, which is 27 years of research on cost, thickness, systematic literature review, and the future research agenda in 12 of May. Wednesday with Dr. Awad Ibrahim from University of Portsmouth in the United Kingdom. Inshallah, I will announce it today in all ITAR accounts that I already posted in the chat. You can always register and most welcome. Also, I want to invite Dr. Wael to this very useful topic and also the lecture. He is very active in research and well known. He published many papers in high-rank journals. I think he has 2 or 3 3-star in ABS ranked journals, and he's very active lecture. Thank you so much, guys, for attending today's webinar. Thank you very much, Dr. Wael, also for your webinar. I really appreciate it, and inshallah, see you next time. Thank you. Salam.